Let me once again welcome you all to this first webinar of the year for the Centre for Studies of Higher Education. I'm David Jennings. I'm chairing this session today. I am delighted to welcome Tessa, who is one of our own here in UCD, and she is going to be speaking to us about a project herself and Hans de Wit have been working on, which is all about geopolitical obstacles to academic freedom. So in a time when our political world is under strife and change, this is quite an interesting and intriguing topic to listen to. So knowledge securitization policies and international academic collaboration. So Tessa, over to you, and very welcome.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for coming. Let me pull up my slides. Yes. So my name is Tessa Laquil. I'm at the UCD School of Education. My colleague Hans de Wit is not here today, but he's a professor emeritus of the Boston College Center for International Higher Education. And today I'll be talking about a paper that's in progress that we're working on, titled Knowledge Securitization Policies in International Academic Collaboration. And taking into account some of the geopolitical turbulence of this time and how that relates to how we think about academic freedom. So we're approaching this paper the way we usually tend to approach this kind of work when I work with Hans, which is to incorporate both philosophy and theory of higher education as well as international relations and international higher education research. So I start with a baseline of thinking about what responsibility might be conceptualized as in ideas of the university from philosophy and theory of higher ed, and then think about how that extends to the way we might think about internationalization or responsible internationalization versus the way the university is responsibilized or securitized in international policy. I then have a few cases. We may not look at all of them, but there's some national cases and some regional cases of how that shows up in policy. And then I suggest there's a few discursive shifts that are happening in terms of the way we're thinking about what university responsibility or academic responsibility looks like in relation to knowledge securitization, and then some implications for international academic collaboration at this early stage of the paper. So as David said, the geopolitical environment has grown increasingly strained in the past years, which has put increased pressure on higher education research, both within national boundaries and across national boundaries through different government mechanisms that have been put into place. And people have been researching into, of course, the tendency and the trends into nationalism for some years now, but also particularly knowledge securitization as a consequence of this. And what researchers say, including San Sabsalib and a 2018 handbook on politics in higher ed, and Shih and colleagues who have been mainly working on this concept of responsible internationalization, say there are two meta-narratives. One tends to this narrative around international academic collaboration requiring openness and globalism being the sort of value or ideology we hold in the international academic community, versus this other narrative of securitization and nationalism, which also spreads in this sort of policy conversation. And so as a result, we've seen in the maybe past 5-7 years, these new guidelines, both at national and regional levels, as well as international levels, for international academic collaboration, which have been framed in certain contexts as responsible internationalization, and then more explicitly as knowledge security more recently. So to start off with that baseline, how do we think about responsibility when we think about ideas of the university? So even in 1789 with Kant's text, Conflict of the Faculties, already there's that distinction made between the university and the government, and the separation required in order for university disciplines to be free and subject only to laws given by reason, not by the government. Because part of their responsibility includes academic kinds of responsibilities, such as examinations and making objections to research from other disciplines, but also this communication of truth and knowledge to the public as well as giving counsel to whatever the authority figure is, the government. So this distinction between the university responsibility in terms of what its academic functions are and the separation from the government and the necessary freedom from the government, which allows it to fulfill its tasks, is already very clear in 1789 with Kant. When we look at Humboldt's 1809 text on the spirit of intellectual institutions, Humboldt is also the one who has the ideas of Lehrfreiheit and Lernfreiheit, freedom of teaching, freedom of researchers, freedom of students to learn or to teach or to research, where academic freedom usually has a foundation. He also talks about universities as having their tasks, including the cultivation of knowledge, which requires that the state keeps out of it in order for the universities to conduct their academic responsibilities properly. He says, the state must understand that intellectual work will go on infinitely better if it does not intrude. That's pretty explicit. Karl Jasper is a more recent writer on the idea of the university, whose work was done in post-World War II Germany. It's kind of a good context for us to look at, given some of the turbulence that's happening now and some of the crumbling of the international order. And he talks about the university in a really interesting and I think useful way, where he says the university is a community of scholars and students that are engaged in the task of seeking truth, deriving its autonomy from an imperishable idea of supranational worldwide character, academic freedom. So the relationship between the universities being as a community of scholars and students, they have a task of seeking truth, and the autonomy of the university comes from something that goes beyond national boundaries, academic freedom. He also talks about communication as necessary to this task, where he says, responsibility of thought flourishes much better in an atmosphere of communication than solitary thought, which meets no resistance, and that the university is meant to function as the intellectual conscience of an era, a place of research necessarily permeated with a sense of reality. So this also relates the task of the university to the necessity of community and of the necessity of communication, both of which go beyond national boundaries, which suggests that the tasks of the university and its responsibilities for seeking truth and being the intellectual conscience, which is sort of echoed in Humboldt's and in Kant's ideas, where there's this public presentation of truth and the role of counseling the government alongside academic responsibilities, means that it needs to have that distance and separation from the state, as well as a space to have a community that goes beyond national boundaries in order to have that kind of communication. So this entanglement of what the university is as community, the notion of academic freedom, and the responsibilities of the university are sort of tied up together in these traditional ideas of the university. So I want to use this set of ideas and these set of notions of what responsibilities might look like for the university in contrast to policy ideas of what that looks like. But before we do that, how does that relate to internationalization? So we already have that a little bit set up in this idea of academic freedom being supranational and the idea of community being supranational and the necessity of communication to do our jobs well in the university. But if we think about the basic functions of the university as being teaching, research, and service, internationalization can be understood as being a meta function. So it's not something distinct, but relates to internationalization of teaching, internationalization of research, internationalization of service, to the basic functions of the university. So we can understand responsible internationalization through these traditional ideas as an extension of the basic responsibilities of the university with a wider geographical space and a more encompassing definition of community. There are definitions of internationalization which encompass this normative function of responsibility alongside a descriptive definition of internationalization. So there's a traditional one from 2015, which includes the process of becoming international, intercultural, etc. in post-secondary education, alongside the normative statement to make a meaningful contribution to society. So that responsibility is embedded, which harkens back to some of the traditional ideas of the university and those kinds of responsibilities. When we look at the 2019 update, it also is very explicit about the wider community, which goes beyond national boundaries. So it's possible to think about responsible internationalization, although these definitions apply to a concept called internationalization of higher education for society. But if we think about responsibility and internationalization in the university, to think about these kinds of definitions of internationalization relating more to traditional ideas of the university. Shih, who's been doing work on a concept of responsible internationalization in relation to business administration and geopolitics, Shih talks about responsible internationalization as a description of what's happening in the policy context. So he says, responsible internationalization focuses on the discretionary responsibilities that researchers have when building international relationships. This means that researchers need to develop their ability to reflect on contextual factors so that a complex portfolio of risks encountered when national borders are crossed can be proactively and realistically managed. This definition is very useful to think about what's actually happening in the policy context when knowledge security becomes one of the issue areas for the government. What it doesn't do is capture well the kinds of ideas of responsibility and internationalization, which are more represented in the ideas of the university we talked about, like Jaspers, and in the ideas like internationalization of higher education for society. So it doesn't really capture what the university's role is as a university within this notion of responsible internationalization. So I suggest that when we think about this shift from an idea of a university which has responsibilities to society to the kind of knowledge securitization we're seeing in policy these days, we can think about two kinds of mutations happening in the concept. One, in a movement from responsibility as social contract to responsibility as integrity and transparency. So responsibility as social contract with a commitment to social engagement, an autonomous university, and a commitment to things like academic freedom and the global public good might relate more to traditional ideas of the university or concepts like internationalization of higher education for society. We also see the shift to integrity and transparency being framed as what the university is responsible for, with more of a commitment to scientific values, where the university is positioned in a knowledge economy, and things like knowledge transfer for national development or soft power diplomacy are the kinds of ends of the university, rather than academic freedom and the global public good. Another kind of mutation from this original idea of the university to what we're seeing in policy is responsibility being framed as knowledge security. So rather than a commitment to societal engagement writ large, you have a commitment to the nation state or national values. You see the university dependent on and governed by the state rather than being autonomous, and you see university research as kind of a pawn on a political chessboard. And I've color-coded these, blue, green, and orange, where responsibility as social contract and a more traditional idea of the university is blue, responsibility as integrity and transparency and commitment to scientific values is green, and responsibility as knowledge security and the nation state and national values is orange. I'm telling you this because some of the data we're going to look at in the national cases and the regional cases will use these colors to help us think about these different kinds of ways of thinking about how the university is responsibilized or securitized. So we have time. We have, for the US case, I think, quite mixed messaging in different documents over the past few years. So this document, this excerpt is from a document titled The Research Program on Research Security, which was commissioned by the National Science Foundation of the United States and authored by an independent science advisory group called JASON. What we see here is in orange, language that relates more to responsibility framed as knowledge security and a commitment to the nation state and national values, and in blue, language that relates more to a traditional idea of the university where the university is committed to societal engagement, is autonomous, and relates to academic freedom and global public good. So I'll read you these two. So talking about a memo that was published in 2021, this document says that the goal of the memo was to strengthen protections of United States government-supported R&D against foreign government interference and exploitation. This is very clearly related to the university's commitment to the nation state, national values, and foreign governments being framed as being interfering or exploitative. On the other hand, there's language like maintaining an open environment to foster research discoveries and innovation that benefit our nation and the world. So what's interesting about that is that the open environment benefits to the nation and the world relate much more to a traditional idea of the university, where there's space for discovery type research, curiosity type research. The research environment is open and collaborative, there's communication, and we have societal benefits that go beyond the national borders to global benefits. So this kind of mixed messaging we see throughout the cases, but it's a good first example to get a sense of how I'm trying to look at this data. From the same document, they recognize, the science advisory group, that there's this conflation of research integrity and research security, and they try to provide definitions of the two. So they define research integrity as an adherence to accepted values. So this is interesting because it relates to then responsibility framed as integrity and transparency and a commitment to scientific values. So research integrity is then adherence to accepted values and principles, objectivity, honesty, openness, accountability, fairness, stewardship. Research security, on the other hand, is protecting the means, know-how, and products of research until they are ready to be shared by approval of leaders of the research program and other stakeholders in their security. The first one is interesting because instead of the kinds of academic values and responsibilities that we usually might see in a traditional idea of the university, these research integrity and responsibility of academics and universities are rather related to scientific values of doing science in a way that's transparent. The research security definition is interesting because knowledge becomes product, so it's objectified, and therefore there's a reason to protect it, not only how you do it, but what it is. And that agency moves from the university as an institution and the academic researchers to leaders of the research program and other stakeholders in their security. So there's this transfer of agency, there's a transfer of what knowledge is and who it's for. It becomes closed and it becomes something that can be protected and is no longer open and shared and good for the world. This example similarly has this tension between, it's from a different document from the National Science Foundation titled NSF Guidelines for Research Security Analytics from 2023. It's referring to the Chips and Science Act from the US and defines foreign countries of concern, which we'll see again in other cases. This is interesting because it's explicit about which countries of concern are included in this concept of countries of concern: the PRC, North Korea, the Russian Federation, and the Islamic Republic of Iran. This list might change, of course, with the new US government. And so that's a very nationalist framing of what the university's relationship to academic collaboration is. The second quote in the same document talks about scientific values: transparency, consistency, fair and unbiased research security practices. Again, you see this shift from university responsibility to society around knowledge, public communication, counsel to the government, to things like building trust with stakeholders. And the actor here is the NSF rather than universities. In a memo in 2024 from the Office of Science and Technology Policy from the Executive Office of the President of the US, titled Guidelines for Research Security Programs at Covered Institutions, again, you see the nationalist language. The open collaborative nature of the US underpins America's science and tech leadership, economic competitiveness, and national security. And where you see that particular countries are named, particular citizenships are targeted, at the same time, the memo suggests that federal research agencies should implement research security policies in a way that treats everyone equally under the law, without xenophobia, prejudice, or discrimination, without targeting, stigmatizing, discriminating against individuals on the basis of race, ethnicity, or national origin. So this tension between the kind of open relationship and kind of collaboration and communication that might be expected in international higher education for society or traditional ideas of the university really can't exist at the same time as this kind of nationalist framing of the responsibility of the university. in international academic collaboration in this way. This one is from the same document. We'll look at the second quote, I think, which is especially interesting. The purpose of the administration's research security efforts is to make sure that institutions of higher education and other research institutions recognize the altered global landscape and fulfill their responsibilities as the first line of defense against improper or illicit activity. Again, this is very explicit. That shift in what responsibility means for the university and what the university is doing in international academic collaboration is shifted. The university's responsibility is now to be the first line of defense against improper or illicit activity. So this shift to responsibility as knowledge security and national security. And so then the research community's responsibility also changes. The research community has to be aware of how foreign countries have different policies and practices, and that if we're not careful, US research and development can contribute to human rights abuse, surveillance, and military aggression. This is a very closed way of thinking about research collaboration as opposed to the way we might do typically within a traditional idea of the university. I like this example. This is from an act from 2025, I believe in February even. It's called Decoupling America's Artificial Intelligence Capabilities from China. This one is very explicit again, because not only does it define what unlawful acts are, it also tells you what the penalties are for violating these standards. So if a United States person may not conduct, attempt, or conspire to conduct research of artificial intelligence or Gen AI within China for an entity of concern on behalf of an entity of concern in collaboration with an entity of concern or for a national. If you conduct these unlawful acts, an entity like a university could be fined up to 100 million, an individual could be fined up to $1 million. This brings us all the way back to the kinds of closures we might have seen in the era of McCarthyism, where you are no longer allowed to participate in research with people from specific countries or with universities in specific countries. So this sort of decline of what academic collaboration looks like over the past few years shows us how there's shift from what responsible internationalization might mean when we think the university's responsibility is to society writ large versus a totally nationalist focus of what the university is for, closing collaborative opportunities rather than opening them. And there have been news articles about how this violates academic freedom. Nonetheless, here it is. It's almost the hour, so I'll pick a couple more. We'll do Australia because it's a different case. Australia focuses more on the threat to economic competition when we talk about what international academic collaboration is. There is language from the 2021 document on the guidelines to counter foreign interference in the Australian university sector that harkens much more back to ideas at the university, for instance, having a globally engaged and open nature of universities, international engagement being underpinned by university autonomy and academic freedom, and sharing and developing knowledge with the best and brightest minds around the world. So this kind of openness is contrasted to language in the same document, which suggests that espionage and foreign interference pose a threat to Australia. University sector is one of the sectors at threat, and the kind of work the university does, including development of new tech, medicines, techniques, and practices, are fundamental to Australia's social and economic prosperity. So the focus then for Australia is much more, at least in 21 in this document, is on economic prosperity, where in the US we see this focus on national security very strongly, and the kind of rivalries that are happening politically for the US in different policy areas. And we also see the benefits to Australia also relating to intellectual property, commercial advantage, but that's linked to things like scientific values around the university community. So the responsibility to protect knowledge or secure knowledge is linked to the potential for interference to lead to self-censorship, conflicts with the principle of academic freedom for members of the university community. So this tension between these kinds of responsibilities is here, but they're sort of being conflated. In the Dutch case, the focus is again on national security. Perhaps we'll skip this one because it's fairly similar to the kind of language you see in the US case, maybe not as extreme. It harkens more to EU language, which is some of the research data that we look at, where you see the basic principle is always open where possible, protected where necessary. This is echoed again and again. There's also a tension between self-regulation and agency for the university and for academics around international academic collaboration versus national security and the role of the government. So this tension is explicit. They say that the approach to knowledge security is built around self-regulation by the knowledge sector, but at the same time, the Dutch central government plays an active role in knowledge security by providing knowledge institutions, information, scope for action, and setting frameworks as needed. So when we look at this in practice, like the US case, even if universities in the language of the policy might have self-regulation or agency, on the other hand, there are very, very concrete frameworks and different levels of implementation required by governments at the university level. Just like the US, you have specific countries named, North Korea and Iran, but they have a map where you can check who the current sanctions are against. So again, this alignment of national security priorities go all the way into knowledge security and for universities, international academic collaboration being restricted. In the case of Denmark, the focus is much more on economic security alongside national security. Those things are treated together, and the language is pretty nationalist. International competition is fierce within research. Danish research may fall into the wrong hands. Some foreign nations may try to illegally procure knowledge and tech and products that Denmark is to live off of in the long term, which is much more economic security, but they also talk about national security, foreign interference, espionage. Also, this one's interesting. Some foreign intelligence services traditionally infiltrate research communities of other countries, and researchers in these countries may be subject to heavy pressure. Citizens of a few authoritarian states are required by law to provide the intelligence services with information of interest to the states in question. What this kind of language does is then, when we talk about our colleagues as, or limiting them to being simply citizens of these authoritarian states, rather than humans who have agency and choose how they want to collaborate, we again restrict the way we think about the international academic community and our disciplinary communities and the way that we want to collaborate to bring about knowledge development around in our fields. And yeah, this one also talks about focus on high-tech and defense-related areas, which is much more national security than necessarily commercial. And Sweden is a different case. Once again, it's closer to the way the EU talks about knowledge security and international academic collaboration, because the kinds of values and ethical problems that are highlighted in the documents are much more around, are much more the kind of language that are used to persuade universities and researchers that internationalization needs to be responsibilized and knowledge needs to be secured. And this document is interesting because it was commissioned by the Swedish Foundation for the International Cooperation in Research and Higher Education, but Shih, who writes about responsible internationalization, and his colleagues authored this document in 2020. So it's a little more academic in its flavor. They talk about internationalization, responsible internationalization in relation to two kinds of framings. One around scientific values, for example, cooperation with partners in countries with rapidly developing research systems, suggesting that ethical frameworks may not be in place as they should, and also in a much more nationalist way around histories of corruption, human rights violations, or democratic, non-democratically governed countries, and that we have to be more scrupulous when developing these collaborations. A 2022 document from the same organization titled Recommendations to Higher Education Institutions on How to Work with Responsible Internationalization. Again, using that language that was developed by Shih and colleagues. They suggest that higher education institutions and researchers are now responsible for a much broader set of conditions, including legal, cultural, political, or ethical conditions in global engagement. In terms of the kinds of language used, again, including security and political concerns, they also talk about ideology, and they're also focused on competition for science rather than simply national security and economic competition. And so they say in the same document, responsible internationalization is a concept that aims to help raise awareness of the need for responsible practices and behavior in international partnerships and at home. So rather than being something that's defined along with a foundation on what the university is and is for, it's focused on this practical risk management approach. But again, you see the focus on the values of the university used at the same time as nationalist language. So in blue is highlighted, internationalization is therefore an inalienable value that needs to be protected and nurtured. At the same time, universities and colleges operate in an increasingly complex and fragmented world with increased geopolitical tensions. This entails an increased focus on protecting national interests, knowledge, technology. So they're able to use both the values from an academic idea of the university alongside a much more nationalist way of thinking about what the university is and is for. And so they say responsible internationalization is a shared responsibility for universities, colleges, funders, and the government, moving away from university autonomy in determining how international academic collaboration takes place and towards shared agency with different stakeholders. In the EU, what's interesting is that there's a shift in rhetoric from very clearly traditional ways of thinking of about what international academic collaboration is for. For example, they say that the environment should be devoid of political interference, defend academic freedom, and provide an opportunity for curiosity-driven research. That EU research and innovation will remain open to the world, and participants from all over the world, regardless of their place of establishment or residence, should be able to participate in the Horizon Europe program. This is from 2021. 2024 suggests that there has to be a tailor-made approach for how we do research security. In accordance with institutional autonomy and academic freedom, higher education institutions are primarily responsible for developing and managing international cooperation. But at the same time, public authorities should provide them assistance and support and ensure that cooperation remains both open and secure. So that language of open and security at the same time shows this conflation of these different forms of what the university is responsible for in international academic collaboration. In the same 2024 document, which was titled Proposal for a Council Recommendation on Enhancing Research Security, the open and secure, open as possible, closed as necessary language is also there, but also economic security and national security. They say in the second quote, steer research security measures to safeguarding economic security, including union and national security, defending shared values, including academic freedom. So academic freedom then becomes enveloped in the sort of national values or shared union values, rather than something that belongs to the university and is determined by the university autonomously, separated from the government. And so I suggest that what's happening is a recontextualization of what university responsibility is. There's a shift from responsible internationalization as what it means within established ideas of the university to respond to what's happening in definitely a very turbulent geopolitical context. So things like academic freedom, responsible internationalization, academic collaboration are then conflated with things like research security, knowledge security, and so are recontextualized within what can be called a preferred reading of what a university-government relationship should look like in international academic collaboration. In the cases of the United States and the Netherlands, the focus is heavily on national security and how national security is threatened by open international academic collaboration. In the case of Australia and Denmark, it tends much more to economic security and competition and the fear of losing any economic or competitive advantage they might have by having an open international academic collaboration space. For Sweden and the EU, there's this balancing of national values, national norms, and a juggling of academic values alongside these national and regional norms. So it suggests that as different governmental entities develop this kind of policy, it shifts by whatever the national and regional political strategies or priorities are at that time. I think that the two mutations from the idea of the university version of what responsibility might mean for the university, responsibility as social contract, a commitment to societal engagement at a global level, academic freedom, versus responsibility as integrity and transparency and a commitment to scientific values, or responsibility as knowledge security, or a mixture of both, and a commitment to the nation state and national values, works fairly well. We're still figuring out whether these are the final categories that we're going to use. I'd be interested in hearing what you guys think, whether these work or not. But I think these mutations help us to think about how what we understand and are committed to as a university community, as researchers, as institutions, can be shifted practically, and in terms of the values that we're committed to through this kind of policy shift. And the way that we approach it can then change what this environment looks like. There are a few implications I'd like to talk about based on this analysis. First, that shift from university autonomy and individual researcher agency in terms of what we see in the ideas of academic freedom and Lernfreiheit, Lehrfreiheit, with regards to conducting academic research. So there's a shift away from that towards shared agency with government entities, with other security stakeholders. There's also a shift in the distance and separation from the government. For instance, in the university I was at in the US, there was a knowledge security office, and the person who ran the office was formerly from the FBI, and the kind of paperwork that was involved now with academic collaboration became much more onerous and changed the freedom of relationship that you might have in international academic collaboration before that. There's also a shift in what the university then becomes responsible for, this responsibilization of the university for political things. For instance, the language around being the first line of defense against foreign interference or illegal transfer of knowledge, to be responsive to whatever geopolitical rivalry is happening at the time, which, as we've seen in recent weeks, can shift very quickly. Also, being responsible to train researchers in knowledge security practices then becomes part of university responsibility. There's a shift in what individual researchers become responsible for being aware of possible espionage, for being aware of foreign interference, being aware of which countries are countries of concern, which changes then how we're able to collaborate freely with whoever might be interesting for us as we develop our research. There's a shift in the concept of what the international academic community could be as part of what the university is, towards a commitment to the nation state or the regional union first, rather than being open to a global community of academics and universities. There's also a shift in how we think about communication and collaboration, the way Carl Jaspers talked about communication as necessary to being a university community and developing good research, and developing what we are as a university to these highly managed partnerships, and not by the university, but by the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa. So if there are any questions, please post them to the chat. You are more than welcome to take the floor. We can actually kind of call you up and you can ask a question directly of Tessa. So take a moment to think about that and post it to the chat. But I have a couple of questions, if I may, Tessa.